Chapter 1. Concerning the two kinds of thinking. It is a well-known fact that one of the principles of analytic psychology is that the dream images are to be understood symbolically. That is to say that they are not to be taken literally just as they are presented in sleep, but that behind them a hidden meaning has to be surmised. This ancient idea of a dream symbolism, which has challenged not only criticism, but in addition to that the strongest opposition. That dreams may be full of import and therefore something to be interpreted is certainly neither a strange nor an extraordinary idea. This has been familiar to mankind for thousands of years, and therefore seems much like a banal truth. The dream interpretations of the Egyptians and Chaldeans and the story of Joseph who interprets Pharaoh's dreams are known to everyone, and the dream book of Artemisius is also familiar. From countless inscribed monuments of all times and peoples we learn of foreboding dreams, of significant, of prophetic, and also of curative dreams which the deity sent to the sick, sleeping in the temple. We know the dream of the mother of Augustus who dreamt she was to be with the child by the deity transformed into a snake. We will not heap up references and examples to bear witness to the existence of a belief in the symbolism of dreams. When an idea is so old and is so generally believed, it is probably true in some way, and indeed, as in mostly the case, is not literally true, but is true psychologically. This distinction lies the reason why the old forges of science have from time to time thrown away an inherited piece of ancient truth. Because it was not literal, but psychologic truth. For such discrimination, this type of person has at no time had any other comprehension. From our experience, it is hardly conceivable that a God existing outside of ourselves causes dreams, or that the dream ego ipso foresees the future prophetically. When we translate this into the psychologic, however, then the ancient theories sound much more reconcilable, namely the dreams arise from a part of the mind unknown to us, but none the less important is concerned with the desires of the approaching day. The psychologic formula derived from the ancient superstitions' conception of dreams is, so to speak, exactly identified with the Freudian psychology, which assumes a rising wish from the unconscious to be the source of a dream. As the old belief teaches, the deity or the demon speaks in symbolic speech to the sleeper, and the dream interpreter has the riddle to solve. In modern speech, we say this means that the dream is a series of images which are apparently contradictory and nonsensical, but arise in reality from psychologic material which yields a clear meaning. Were I to suppose among my readers a far-reaching ignorance of dream analysis, then I should be obliged to illustrate their statement with numerous examples. Today, however, these things are quite well known, so that one must proceed carefully with everyday dream material, out of consideration for a public educated in these manners. It is a special inconvenience that no dream can be recounted without being obliged to add to it half a life's history, which affords the individual foundations of a dream. But there are some few typical dreams which can be told without too great a ballast. One of these is the dream of a sexual assault, which is especially prevalent among women. A girl sleeping after an evening happily spent in dancing dreams that a robber breaks open her door noisily and stabs through her body with a lance. This theme, which explains itself, has countless variations. Some simple, some complicated. Instead of a lance, it is a sword, a dagger, a revolver, a gun, a cannon, a hydrant, a watering pot, or the assault is a burglary, a pursuit, a robbery, or it is someone hidden in the closet or under the bed. Or the danger may be illustrated by wild animals. For instance, a horse which throws the dreamer to the ground and kicks her in the body with his hind foot, lions, tigers, elephants with threatening trunks, and finally snakes in endless variety. Sometimes the snake creeps into the mouth, sometimes it bites the breast like Cleopatra's legendary ASP. Sometimes it comes in the role of the parasitical snake with the variations of Franz Stuck, whose picture of snakes bear the significant titles vice, sin, and lust. The mixture of lust and anxiety is expressed incomparably in the very atmosphere of these pictures, and far more brutally indeed than in Maurice's charming poem, The Maiden's First Love Song. What is in the net? Behold, but I am afraid. Do I grasp a sweet eel? Do I seize a snake? Love is a blind fisherwoman. Tell the child where to seize. Already it leaps in my hands. Oh, pity or delight, with nestlings and turnings it coils on my breast. It bites me, oh wonder, boldly through the skin it darts under my heart. Oh, love, I shudder, when can I do, what can I begin? A shuddering thing, there it crackles within the coils, in a ring. It must be poisoned. Here it crawls around. Blissfully I feel as it wounds itself into my soul, and kills me finally. All these things are simple and need no explanation to be intelligible. Somewhat more complicated, but still unmistakable, is the dream of a woman. She sees the triumphant arch of Constantine. A cannon stands before it, to the right of it a bird, to the left a man. A shot flashes out of a tube. The projectile hits her. It goes into her pocket, into her purse. There it remains, and she holds her purse as if something very precious were in it. The image disappears, and she continues to see only the stock of the cannon, and over that Constantine's motto, in hoc signo vinces. These few references to the symbolic nature of dreams are perhaps sufficient. For whomsoever the proof may appear insufficient, and is certainly insufficient for a beginner, further evidence may be found in the fundamental work of Freud, and in the works of Stekel and Rank, which are fuller in certain particulars. We must assume here that the dream symbolism is an established fact, in order to bring to our study a mind suitably prepared for an appreciation of his work. We would not be successful if we, on the contrary, were to be astonished at the idea that an intellectual image could be projected into our conscious psychic activity, an image which apparently obeys such wholly other laws and purposes than those governing the conscious psychic product. Why are dreams symbolic? Every why of psychology is divided into two separate questions. First, for what purpose are dreams symbolic? We will answer this question, only to abandon it at once. Dreams are symbolic in order that they cannot be understood, in order that the wish which is the source of a dream may remain unknown. The question why this is so, and not otherwise, leads us out into the far-reaching experiences and trains and thoughts of Freudian psychology. Here the second question interests us, viz., how is that dreams are symbolic? That is to say, from where does this capacity for symbolic representation come, of which we in our conscious daily life can discover apparently no traces? Let us examine this more closely. Can we really discover nothing symbolic in our everyday thought? Let us follow our trains of thought. Let us take an example. We think of the War of 1870 and 1871. We think about a series of bloody battles, the Siege of Strasbourg, Belfort, Paris, the Treaty of Peace, the foundation of Germany Empire, and so on. How have we been thinking? We start with an idea, or super idea as it is so called, without thinking of it, but each time merely guided by a feeling of direction. We think about individual reminiscences of the war. In this we can find nothing symbolic, and our whole conscious thinking proceeds according to this type. If we observe our thinking very narrowly and follow an intensive train of thought, as for example the solution to a difficult problem, then suddenly we notice that we are thinking in words, that in wholly intensive thinking we begin to speak to ourselves. We occasionally write down the problem or make a drawing of it as to be absolutely clear. It must certainly have happened to anyone who has lived for some time in a foreign country, that after a certain period he has begun to think in the language of the country. A very intensive train of thinking words itself out more or less in word form. That is, if one wants to express it, to teach it, or to convince anyone of it, evidently it directs itself wholly to the outside world. To this extent, this directed or logical thinking is a reality thinking, having a real existence for us, that is to say, a thinking which adjusts itself to actual conditions, or expressed in other words, and imitate the succession of objectivity real things, so that the images in our mind follow after each other in the same strictly causal succession as the historical events outside of our mind. We call this thinking with directed attention. It has in addition the peculiarity that one is tired by it, that on this account it is set into action only for a time. Our whole vital accomplishment, which is so expensive, is adaptation to environment. A part of it is the directed thinking, which biologically expressed is nothing but a process of psychic assimilation, which, as in every vital accomplishment, leaves behind a corresponding exhaustion. The material of which we think is language and speech concept, a thing which has been used from time immemorial as something external, a bridge for thought, and which has a single purpose, that of communication. As long as we think directly, we think of others and speak to others. Speech is originally a system of emotional and imitative sounds, sounds which express terror, fear, anger, love, and sounds which imitate the noises of the elements, the rushing and gurgling of water, the rolling of thunder, the tumults of the winds, and the tones of the animal world, and so on. And finally, those which represent a combination of the sounds of perception and of affective reaction. Likewise, in the more or less modern languages, large quantities of onomatopoetic relics are retrained. For example, sounds for the movement of water. Rauschen, Rislin, Russian, Rinner, Rennerin to rush, Russelo, Rizeru, river, rain. Wasser, Wizen, Wizerin, Pissin, Pissis, fish. The language is originally and essentially nothing but a system of signs or symbols which denote real occurrences or their echo in the human soul. Therefore, one must decidedly agree with Anatole France when he says, "What is thought, and how do we think? We think with words. That alone is sensual and brings us back to nature. Think of it. The metaphysician has only the perfected cry of monkeys and dogs, which to construct the systems of the word. That which he calls profound speculation and transcendent method is to put an end in an arbitrary order the natural sounds which cry out hunger, fear, and love, in the primitive forests into which were attached little by little the meaning which one believed to be abstract when they were only crude. Do not fear that the succession of small cries, feeble and stifled, which compose a book of philosophy, will teach us so much regarding the universe that we can live in it no longer. Thus is our directed thinking, and even if we were the loneliest and furthest removed from our fellows, this thinking is nothing but the first notes of a long drawn-out call to our companions, that water had been found, that we had killed the bear, that a storm was approaching, or the wolves were prowling around the camp. A striking paradox of Alibard's which expresses in a very intuitive way the whole human limitations of our complicated thinking process reads, Sermo genitur ab intellectu et gentrant intellectum. Any system of philosophy, no matter how abstract, represents in means and purpose nothing more than an extremely cleverly developed combination of original nature sounds. Hence arises the desire of a Schopenhauer or an Nietzsche for recognition and understanding in the despair and bitterness of their loneliness. One might expect, perhaps, that a man full of genius would pasture in the greatness of his own thought, and renounce the cheap approbation of a crowd which he despises. Yet he succumbs to the more powerful impulse of a herd instinct. His searching and his findings, his call belong to the herd. When I said just now that direct thinking is properly a thinking with words, and quoted that clever testimony of Anatole France as drastic proof of it, a misunderstanding might easily arise, namely that directed thinking is really only a word. That certainly would go too far. Language should, however, be comprehended in a wider sense than that of speech, in which is in itself only the expression of a formulated thought which is capable of being communicated in the widest sense. Otherwise, the deaf mute would be limited to the utmost in his capacity for thinking, which is not the case in reality. Without any knowledge of the spoken word, He has his language. This language considered from the standpoint of history, or in other words, directed thinking, is here a descendant of a primitive words, as for instance one expresses it. A further important result of that cooperation of sound and sign interchange consists in the fact that very many words gradually lose altogether their original concrete thought, meaning, and turn into sounds for general ideas and for the expressions of appreciative function of relation and comparison in their products. In this manner abstract thought develops, which, because it would not be possible without the change of meaning lying at the root of it, is indeed a production of that psychic and psychophysical reciprocal action out of which the development of language takes place. Yodel denies the identity of language and thought because, for one reason, one and the same psychic fact might be expressed in different languages in different ways. From that he draws the conclusion that a superlanguage thinking exists. Certainly there is such a thing, whether with Erderman one considers it hypologisch and Jodl as superlanguage. Only the following matter complete these definitions of William James. This sort of thinking does not tire us. It quickly leads us away from reality into fantasies of the past and future. Here, thinking in the form of speech ceases at image, crowds upon image, feeling upon feelings. More and more clearly, one sees a tendency which creates and makes believe, not as it truly is, but as one indeed might wish it to be. The material of these thoughts, which turns away from reality, can naturally be one of the past in its thousand memory pictures. The customary speech calls the kind of thinking dreaming. Whoever attentively observes himself with the general custom of speech varies strikingly, for almost every day we can see of ourselves how in falling asleep fantasies are woven into our dreams, so that between the dreams of day and night there is not so great a difference. Thus we have two forms of thinking, directed thinking and dream or fantasy thinking. The first, working for communication with speech elements, is troublesome and exhausting. The latter, on the contrary, goes on without trouble, working spontaneously, so to speak, with reminiscence. The first creates innovations, adaptations, imitates reality, and seeks to act upon it. The latter, on the contrary, turns away from reality, sets free subjective wishes, and is, in regard to adaptation, wholly unproductive. Let us leave aside the query as to why we possess these two different ways of thinking, and turn back to the second proposition, namely, how come it that we have two different ways of thinking? I have intimated above the history shown us that directed thinking was not always as developed as it is at the present. It is the aged and most beautiful expression of directed thinking is science, and the technique fostered by it. Both things are indebted for their existence simply to an energetic education in directed thinking. At the time, however, when a few forerunners of the present culture, like the poet Petrarch, first began to appreciate nature understandingly, there was already in existence an equivalent for our sciences, to wit, scholasticism. This took its objects from the fantasies of the past and gave it to the mind of a dialect training in directed thinking. The only success which beckoned the thinker was rhetorical victory in disputation, and not as visible transportation of reality. The subjects of thinking were often astonishingly fantasistical. For example, questions were discussed such as how many angels could have a place on the point of a needle, whether Christ could have done his work of redemption equally well if he had come into the world as a pea. The possibility of such problems, to which belong the metaphysical problems in general, viz. To be able to know the unknowable, show us of what peculiar kind that mind must have been which created such things which to us are the height of absurdity. And as each had guessed, however, at the biological background of the phenomenon when he spoke of the beautiful tension of the Germanic mind which the Middle Ages created. Taken historically, scholarism is the spirit of which persons of towering intellectual powers, such as Thomas of Aquinius, Duns Scotus, Albard, William of Ocean, and others, have labored, and is the mother of a modern scientific attitude. In a later time we'll see clearly how and in what scholasticism still furnishes living undercurrents to the science and today. Its whole nature lies in dialect gymnastics, which have raised the symbol of speech, the word, to an almost absolute meaning, so that it finally attained to that sustainably which expiring antiquity could lend to its logos only temporarily through attributes of mystical valuation. The great work of scholarism, however, appears to be the foundation of firmly knitted intellectual sublimation, the conico sine qua non of a modern scientific and technical spirit. Should we go further back into history, we shall find which today we call science dissolved into an indistinct cloud. The modern culture-creating mind is incessantly occupied in stripping of all subjectivity from experience, and in finding those formulas which bring nature and her forces to the best and most fitting expression. It would be an absurd and entirely unjustified self-glorification if we were to assume that we are more energetic or more intelligent than the ancients. Our materials for knowledge have increased, but not our intellectual capacity. For this reason, we become immediately as obstinate and insusceptible in regard to new ideas as people in the darkest times of antiquity. Our knowledge has increased, but not our wisdom. The main point of our interest is displaced wholly into material reality. Antiquity preferred a mode of thought which has more closely related to a fantastic type. Except for a sensitive perspective towards works of art, not attained since then, we seek in vain in antiquity for that precise and concrete matter of thinking characteristic of modern science. We see the antique spirit create not science, but mythology. Unfortunately, we acquire in school only a very paltry conception of the richness and immense powers of life of Grecian mythology. Therefore, at first glance, it does not seem possible for us to assume that the energy and interest which today we put into science and technique, the man of antiquity gave in great part to his mythology, that nevertheless gives the explanation for the bewildering changes, the kaleidoscopic transformations and new synergistic grouping, and the continued rejuvenation of the myths in the Grecian sphere of culture. Here we move in a world of fantasies which little concern with the outer course of things, flows from an inner source, and constantly changing creates now plastic, now shadowy spheres. The fantastical activities of the ancient mind created artistically par excellence. The object of the interest does not seem to have been the grasp hold of a how of the real world as objectively and exactly as possibly, but to aesthetically adapt subjective fantasies and expectations. There is very little place among ancient people who for the coldness and disillusions which Giordano Bruno's thoughts on eternity and Kepler's discoveries brought to modern humanity. The naive man of antiquity saw in the sun of the great Father of the heaven and the earth, and in the moon the fruitful good mother. Everything had its demons. They animated equally a human being and his brother the animal. Everything was considered according to its anthropomorphic or thermomorphic attributes as human being or animal. Even the disk of the sun was given wings, or 4 feet, in order to illustrate its movement. Thus arose an idea of the universe which was not only very far from reality, but was one which corresponded wholly to subjective fantasies. We know from our own experience the state of mind is an infantile stage. To a child, the mood is a man or a face or a shepherd of the stars. The clouds in the sky scheme like little sheep. The dolls drink, eat, and sleep. The child places a letter at the window for the Christ child. He calls to the stork to bring him a little brother or sister. The cow is his wife or the horse, and the dog the husband of the cat. We know, too, that lower races like the Negroes look upon the locomotive as an animal and call the drawers of a table the child of the table. As we learn through Freud, the dream shows a similar type. Since the dream is unconcerned with the real condition of things, it brings the most heterogeneous matters together in a world of impossibilities. It takes the place of realities. Freud finds progression characteristic of thinking when awake, that is to say, the advancement of the thought, exaltation from the system of the inner or outer perception for the endopsychic work of association. Conscious and unconscious to the motor end, that is to say, towards intervention, is the dream he finds the reverse, namely regression of the thought, exaltation from the preconscious or unconscious to the system of perception by the means of which the dream receives its ordinary impression of sensuous distinctiveness, which can rise to an almost hallucinating clearance. The dream thinking moves in retrograde manner toward the raw material of memory. The structure of a dream thought is dissolved during the progress of regression into the raw material. Reanimation of the original perception is, however, only one side of regression. The other side is regression to the infantile memory material, which might also be understood as regression to the original perception, but which deserves especial mention on account of its independent importance. This regression might indeed be considered as historical. The dream, according to this conception, might also be described as a substitute of the infantile scene, changed through transference into the recent scene. The infantile scene cannot carry through its revival. It must be satisfied with its return as a dream. From this conception of the historical side of regression follows consequently that the modes of conclusion of a dream, insofar as one may speak of them, must show at the same time an analogous and infantile character. This is true the case as experience has abundantly shown, so that today everyone who is familiar with the subject of dream analysis confirms Freud's suspicions that dreams are a piece of the conquered life of a childish soul. Inasmuch as the childish psychic life is undeniably of an archaic type, this characteristic belongs to a dream in quite an unusual degree. Freud calls our attention to this especially. The dream which fulfills its wishes by a short regressive path affords us only an example of the primary method of working on the psychic apparatus which is abandoned by us as unsuitable. That which once ruled in the waking state when the physical life was still young and impotent appears to be banished to the dream life. In somewhat the same way, the bow and arrow, those discarded primitive weapons of adult humanity, have been relegated to the nursery. All this experience suggests to us that we draw a parallel between the phantasitical and mythological thinking of antiquity and the similar thinking of children between the lower human races and dreams. The train of thought is not a strange one for us, but quite familiar through our knowledge of comparative anatomy and the history of development, which shows us how the structure and functions of the human body are the result of a series of embryonic changes which correspond to similar changes in the history of a race. Therefore, the supposition is justified that ontogenesis corresponds in psychology to phylogenesis. Consequently, it would be true as well that the state of infantile thinking in a child's psychic life, as well as in dreams, is nothing but a re-echo of the prehistoric and the ancient. In regard to this, Nietzsche takes a very broad and remarkable standpoint. In our sleep and in our dreams, we pass through the whole thought of earlier humanity. I mean, in the same way that the man reasons in his dreams, he reasoned when he is in waking state thousands of years. The first causa which occurred to his mind in reference to anything that needed explanation satisfied him and passed for truth. In the dreams, this atavitic relic of humanity manifests its existence within us, for it is the foundation upon which the higher rational faculty developed and which is still developing in every individual. The dream carries us back into earlier states of human culture and affords us a means of understanding it better. The dream thought is so easy to us now because we are so thoughtfully trained to it through the interminable stages of evolution through which the phantastic and facile form of theorizing has prevailed. To a certain extent, the dream is a restorative to the brain, which during the day is called upon to meet the severe demands for trained thought made by the conditions of a higher civilization. From these facts, we can understand how lately more accurate logical thinking, the taking seriously of cause and effect, have been developed when our functions of reason and intelligence still reach back involuntarily to those primitive forms of conclusion, and we live about half our lives in this condition. We have recently seen that Freud, independently of Nietzsche, has reached a similar standpoint from the basis of dream analysis. The step from this established proposition to the perception of the myths as familiar dream images is no longer for a great one. Freud has formulated this conclusion himself. The investigation of this folk psychological formation, myths, etc., is by no means finished at present. To take an example of this, however, it is probable that the myths correspond to the distorted residue of wish fantasies of whole nations, the secularized dreams of young humanity. Rank understands that the myth in a similar manner as the mass dreams of the people. Ricklin has insisted rightly upon the dream mechanisms of the fables, and Abraham has done the same for the myths. He says the myth is a fragment of the infantile soul and life of a people, and thus the myth is a sustained, still remaining fragment from the infantile soul life to the people, and dream is the myth of the individual. An unprejudiced reading of the above-mentioned authors will certainly allay all doubts concerning the intimate connection between dream psychology and myth psychology. The conclusions result almost from itself that the age which created the myths grew childishly, that is to say, fantastically as in our age is still done, to a very great extent associatively or analogically in dreams. The beginning of myth formations in the child, the taking of fantasies for realities, which is partly in accord with the historical, may easily be discovered among children. One might raise the objection that the mythological inclinations of children are implanted by education. The objection is futile. Has humanity at all ever broken loose from the myths? Every man has eyes and all his senses to perceive that he wood is dead, cold and unending, and he has never yet seen a god, nor brought to light the existence of such from empirical necessity. On the contrary, there are need of a fantastic, indestructible optimism, and one far removed from all sense of reality, in order, for example, to discover in the shameful death of Christ really the highest salvation and redemption of the world. Thus one can indeed withhold from a child the substance of earlier myths, but not take from him the need for mythology. One can say that should it happen that all traditions in the world were cut off with a single blow, then with the succeeding generation the whole mythology and history of religion would start over again. Only a few individuals succeeding in throwing off mythology in a time of a certain intellectual supremacy, the mass never frees itself. Explanations are of no avail. They merely destroy a transitory form of manifestation, but not the creating impulse. Let us again take our earlier train of thought. We speak of the onogenic re-echo of the phylogenic psychology among children. We saw that fantastic thinking is a characteristic of antiquity of the child and of the lower races. But we now also know of our modern and adult man is given over in large part to the same fantastic thinking, which enters as soon as the directed thinking ceases. A lessening of the interest, a slight fatigue, is sufficient to put an end to the directed thinking, the exact psychological adaptation to the real world, and replace it with fantasies. We digress from the theme and give way to our own trains of thought. If the slackening of the attention increases, and we lose by degrees the consciousness of the present, and a fantasy enters into possession of the field. Here the important question obtrudes itself: how are fantasies created? From the poets we learn much about it, from science we learn little. The psychoanalytic method presented to science by Freud shed light upon this for the first time. It showed us that there are typical cycles. The shudder imagines he is a great orator. The truth of this, Demosthenes, thanks to his energy, is proven. The poor man imagines himself to be a millionaire, the child an adult. The conquered fight our victorious battles with the conqueror. The unfit torments or delights himself with ambitious plans. We imagine that which we lack. The interesting question of the why of all this we must here leave unanswered while we return to the historic problem. For what source do fantasies draw their materials? We choose as an example a typical fantasy of puberty. A child is that stage before whom the whole frightening uncertainty of the future fate opens, puts back the uncertainty into the past through his fantasy, and says, "If only I were not the child of my ordinary parents, but the child of a rich and fashionable count, and had been merely passed over into my parents, then some day a golden coach would come, and the count would come his child back, and him to his wonderful castle." And so it goes, as in Grimm's fairy tale, which the mother tells to her children. With a normal child, it stops with a fugitive, quickly passing idea, which is soon covered over and forgotten. However, at one time, and that was the ancient world of culture, the fantasy was an openly acknowledged institution. The heroes I recall, Romulus and Remus, Sir Marius and Moses, and many others, have been separated from their real parents. Others are directly sons of gods, and the noble races derive their family trees from heroes and gods. As one sees by this example, the fantasy of modern humanity is nothing but a re-echo of an old folk belief, which was very widespread originally. The ambitious fantasy chooses among others a form which is classic, and one which had a true meaning. The same thing holds good in regard to the sexual fantasy. In the preamble we have spoken of dreams of sexual assault, the robber who breaks into the house and commits a dangerous act. That too is a mythological theme, and in a prehistoric era was certainly a reality too. wholly apart from the fact that the capture of women was something general in the lawless prehistoric time. It was also a subject of mythology and cultivated epics. I recall the capture of Proserpina, Deianira, Europa, the Sabian woman, etc. We must not forget that even today marriage is custom at exit in various regions which recall the ancient customs of marriage by capture. The symbolism of the instrument of coitus was an inexhaustible material for ancient fantasy. It furnished a widespread cult that was designed phallic, the object of reverence of which was the phallus. The companion of Dionysus was Thales, personification of a phallus proceeding from the phallic Hermes of Dionysus. The phallic symbols were countless. Among the Sabians, the custom existed for the bridegroom to part the bride's hair with a lance. The bird, the fish, and the snake were phallic symbols. And in addition, there existed in enormous quantities theriomorphic representations of the sexual instinct in connection with which the bull, the he-goat, the ram, the boar, and the ass were frequently used. An undercurrent to this choice of symbol is furnished by the sodomic inclination of humanity. When in a dream of fantasy of modern man, the feared man is replaced by an animal, there is occurring in the ontogenic re-echo the same thing which was only openly represented by the ancients countless times. There were he-goats which pursued nymphs, satyrs with she-goats. In still older times in Egypt, there even existed a shrine of a goat god, which the Greeks called Pan, where the Hierodists prostituted themselves with goats. It is well known that this worship has not died out, but continues to live as a special custom in South Italy and Greece. Today we feel for such a thing nothing but the deepest abhorrence, and never should admit it still slumbered in our souls. Nevertheless, just as truly as the idea of sexual assault is there, so are these things there too, which we should contemplate still more closely, not through moral eye glasses with horror, but with interest as a natural science, since these things are venerable relics of the past culture periods. We have even today a clause in our penal code against sodomy. But that which was once so strong as to give rise to a worship among a highly developed people has probably not wholly disappeared from the human soul during the course of a few generations. We may not forget that since the synopsis of Plato, which homosexuality faces us on the same level with the so-called normal sexuality, only 80 generations had passed. And what are 80 generations? They shrink to an imperceptible period of time when compared with the space of time which separates us from the Homo neanderthals, or Heidelbergerians, I might call the mind in this connection. Some choice thought of the great historian Guerrero Ferrero. It is a very common belief that the furthest man is separated from the present by time, the more does he differ from us in his thoughts and feelings, that the psychology of humanity changes from century to century like fashions of literature. Therefore, no sooner do we find in past history an institution, a custom, law, or a belief a little different from those of which we are familiar, than we immediately search for some complex meanings which frequently resolve themselves into phrases of doubtful significance. Indeed, man does not change so quickly. His psychology at bottom remains the same, and even if his culture varies much from one epoch to another, it does not change the functioning of his mind. The fundamental laws of the mind remain the same, at least during the short historical period of which we have knowledge, and all phenomena, even the most strange, must be capable of explanation by those common laws of the mind which we can recognize in ourselves. The psychologist should accept the viewpoint without reservations as peculiarity applicable to himself. Today, in our civilization, the phallic processions, the Dionysian mysteries of classical Athens, the barefaced phallic emblems have disappeared from our coins, houses, temples, and streets. So also have the theriomorphic representations of the deity been reduced to a small remnants, like the dove of the Holy Ghost, the Lamb of God, and the cock of Peter adorning our church towers. In the same way, the capture and violation of women have shrunken away to crimes. Yet all of this does not affect the fact that we in childhood go through a period in which the impulses toward these archaic inclinations appear again and again. that through all of our life we possess side by side with the newly recruited, directed, and adapted thought, a phanetic thought which corresponds to the thought of the centuries of antiquity and barbarism. Just as our bodies still keep the reminders of old functioning conditions and many old-fashioned organs, so our minds too, which apparently have outgrown those archaic tendencies, nevertheless bear the marks of the evolution passed through, and the very ancient re-echoes, at least dreamily, in fantasies. The symbolism which Freud has discovered is revealed as an expression of a thinking and of an impulse limited to the dream, to wrong conduct, and the derangements of a mind which form of thinking and impulse at one time ruled as the mightiest influence in past culture epics. The question of whence comes the inclination and ability which enables the mind to express itself symbolically brings us to the distinction between the two kinds of thinking, the directed and adapted on one hand, and on the subjective, fed by our own egotistic wishes, on the other. The latter form of thinking, presupposing that if we're not constantly corrected by the adapted thinking, must necessarily produce an overwhelmingly subjective, distorted idea to the world. We regard this state of mind as infantile. It lies in our individual past and in the past of mankind. With this, we affirm the important fact that man in his phanetic thinking has kept a consideration of a psychic history of his development. An extraordinarily important task, which even today is hardly possible, is to give a systemic description of a phanetic thinking. One day at the most sketch it. While directed thinking is a phenomenon conscious throughout, the same cannot be asserted of phanetic thinking. Doubtless a great part of it still falls entirely in the realm of the conscious, but at least just as much goes along in the half-shadows, and generally an undetermined amount in the unconscious. And this can, therefore, be disclosed only indirectly by means of phanetic thinking. Directed thinking is connected with the oldest foundations of the human mind, which have been for a long time beneath the threshold of a consciousness. The product of this phanetic thinking, arising directly from the consciousness, are first waking dreams, or daydreams, to which Freud, Florey, Pick, and others have given special attention. Then the dreams which offer to the consciousness at first a mysterious exterior, and when meaning only through the indirectly interfered unconscious contents. Lastly, there is a so-called wholly unconscious fantasy system to split off conflicts, which exhibits a pronounced tendency towards the production of a dissociated personality. Our foregoing explanations show wherein the products arising from the unconscious are related to the mythical. From all these signs, it may be concluded that the soul possesses in some degree historical strata, the oldest stratum of which would correspond to the unconscious. The result of that must be an introversion occurring in later life, according to Freudian teaching, seizes upon regressive infantile reminiscence taken from the individual past. That first points out the way, then the stronger introversions and regressions, strong repressions, introversions, psychosis, there come to light pronounced traits of an archaic mental kind, which under certain circumstances might go as far as the re-echo of a at once manifest archaic mental production. This problem deserves to be more thoroughly discussed. As a concrete example, let us take the history of Pius Abbe Auger, which Anatole France has communicated to us. This priest was a hypercritical man and much given to fantasies, especially in regard to one question, the late of Judas, whether he was really damned, as of the teaching of church asserts that everlasting punishment, or whether God had pardoned him after all. Auger sided with his intelligent point of view that God, in his all wisdom, had chosen Judas as an instrument in order to bring about the highest point of the work of redemption by Christ. This necessary instrument, without the help of which the human race would not have been a sharer in salvation, could not possibly be damned by the all-good God. In order to put an end to his doubts, Auger went one night to the church and made supplication for a sign that Judas was saved. Then he felt a heavenly touch upon his shoulder. Following this, Auger told the archbishop of his resolution to go out into the world to preach God's unending mercy. Here we have a richly developed fantasy system before us. It is concerned with the subtle and perpetually undecided question as to whether the legendary figure of Judas is damned or not. The Judas legend is, in itself, mythical material, viz. The malicious betrayal of a hero. I recall Siegfried and Hagen, Balder and Loki. Siegfried and Balder were murdered by a faithless traitor from among their closest associates. This myth is moving and tragic. It is not honorable battle which kills the noble, but evil treachery. It is too an occurrence which is historical over and over again. One thinks of Caesar and Brutus, since the myth of such a deed is very old, and still the subject of teaching and repetition. It is the expression of a psychological fact that envy does not allow humanity to sleep, that all of us carry in a hidden recess of our heart a deadly wish towards the hero. This rule can be applied generally to mythical traditions. It does not set forth any account of old events, but rather acts in such a way that it always reveals a thought common to humanity, and once more rejuvenated. Thus, for example, the lives and deeds of the founders of old religions are the purest condensations of typical contemporaneous myths, behind which the individual figure entirely disappears. But why does our pious Abbe torment himself with the old Judas legend? He first went into the world to preach the gospel of mercy, and then after some time he separated from the Catholic Church and became a Swedenborgian. Now we understand his Judas fantasy. It was the Judas who betrayed his Lord. Therefore, first of all, he had to make sure of a divine mercy in order to be Judas in peace. This case throws a light upon the mechanisms of the fantasies in general. The known conscious fantasy may of mythical or other material. It is not to be taken seriously as such, for it has an indirect meaning. If we take it, however, an important per se, then the thing is not understandable and makes one despair of the efficiency of the mind. But we saw in the case of Abbe Ager that his doubts and his hopes did not turn upon the historical problem of Judas, but upon his own personality, which wished to win a way to freedom of itself to the solution of a Judas problem. The conscious fantasies tell us of mythical or other material of underdeveloped or no longer recognized wish tendencies in the soul. As is easily to be understood, an intimate tendency, an acknowledgment of which one refuses to make and which one treats as non-existent, can hardly contain a thing that can be in accord with our conscious character. It concerns the tendencies which are considered immoral and as generally impossible. The strongest resentment is felt towards bringing them into the consciousness. What would Ager have said had been told confidentially that he was preparing himself for the Judas role? And what in ourselves do we consider immoral and non-existent, or which we at least wish were non-existent? It is that which is iniquity lay widespread on the surface, sexuality in all its various manifestations. Therefore, we need not wonder in the least when we find this at the base of most of our fantasies, even if the fantasies have a different appearance. As Ager found the damnation of Judas incompatible with God's goodness, he thought about the conflict in a way that is the conscious sequence. Although this is the unconscious sequence, as Ager himself wished to be a Judas, he first made sure to the goodness of God to ogre Judas was the symbol of his own unconscious tendency. He made use of his symbol in order to be able to meditate over his unconscious wish. The direct coming into consciousness of a Judas wish would have been too painful for him. Thus there must be typical myths which are really the instruments of a folk psychological complex treatment. Jacob Burckhardt seems to have suspected this when he once said that every Greek of the classical era carried himself a fragment of a Oedipus, just as every German carries a fragment of Faust. The problem which the simple story of the Abbe Ager has brought clearly before us confronts us again when we prepare to examine fantasies which owe their existence this time to an exclusively unconscious work. We are indebted to the material which we will use in the following chapters to the useful publications of American woman Miss Frank Miller, who has given to the world some poetical unconscious form fantasies under the title Quelques Fates d'Imitation Créative, Subconscious Volume, Archives de Psychology, 1906.